Hello all, I'm Ben, right next to me is Gil, and we're here to tell you about Pay2Key, the newly discovered ransomware traced all the way to Iran, conveniently also spelled out for you in this opening slide. Well, before I say anything, I have to ask the following question, which is why would you want to hear a talk about a ransomware at all? We're drowning in ransomware. There's our evil Conti, Doppelpaymer, Maze, Mespinoza. I could stand here and read out loud names of ransomware strains all day. But after all, we did decide that this talk would be worthwhile. And the reason is every piece of malware, no matter how pedestrian at first sight, has something new to tell us. And in this case, if you're listening to this talk, you ought to be interested in two aspects of the ransomware. The first of which is if there is anything technically interesting about it, anything it does differently from the usual ransomware. And the second is if there are any juicy or interesting details surrounding the attack, the Pay2Key attack. The who, the why, the how. So broadly speaking, I'm going to tell you about the first part, the technical part, because that's my job, looking at assembly all day. And Gil will later tell you about the actually interesting part, the all juicy details surrounding the attack story. And where should I begin telling the story of Pay2Key? Well, I should begin at the beginning. It was a nice day during late 2020. We were all drinking our cocktails, and suddenly we were horrified to learn that there's been an attack and multiple Israeli companies were compromised. And getting hit with ransomware you have heard of before is bad enough. But getting hit with ransomware you haven't heard of before is somehow adding insult to injury. You don't even know who these guys are. We could only speculate when we stepped into this incident what their motive was. Usually ransomware is financially motivated, but still we could only speculate. And before I get into the technical details that were interesting about this specific malware, I would just like to say that I think I will remember it as the milestone it was during the rise to prominence of double extortion. You've heard of double extortion. It used to be that attackers would threaten victims with their data being lost forever, but then we all discovered backups. And now what attackers do is threaten victims with their data being shared with the public, with competitors, with the highest bidder. And this is a much ickier threat because your backups are not going to save you anymore. Really, if you're looking for a solution to double extortion, then it's pretty simple. Don't have secrets and don't get hacked. So now that we have that sorted out, I mean, seriously, this is a major inflection point in the evolution of ransomware. You can divide ransomware into before double extortion and after double extortion. The earliest known instance of double extortion was late 2019 by the Maze ransomware gang. It was a whole big deal. You can go look it up if you'd like. And since then, from then until late 2020, when these Pay2Key incidents happened, there was like some kind of a slow drip of more and more double extortion, and the Pay2Key attacks were a milestone during that entire period where we started to internalize the fact that this is the future, this is where ransomware is going. So if I had to name one aspect where Pay2Key was technically important, then this would certainly make the top of the list. But it would not constitute, of course, the entire list, or there wouldn't be a talk. So what is technically interesting about this ransomware? Broadly speaking, the answer is divided into three parts. The first is file reads and writes where there should not be file reads and writes. The second is CNC communication where there should not be CNC communication. And the third is interesting and creative choices when implementing cryptography, which is personally my favorite category. So since we don't have much time, let's dive into the first category, which is file reads and writes, where there should not be file reads and writes. This ransomware, this is a very interesting fact about it, it does not run. You double click it, it will do nothing because it is looking for a configuration file called config.ini, and if the configuration is not there or is malformed or I don't know what, then the malware will not run. Now this is weird because it makes things more complicated. Now suddenly, because you need this whole environment for the malware to run, half your favorite malicious tools like downloaders and exploit kits and I don't know what will not work out of the box, and this is a shame for these guys. You know, cyber criminals, they like nothing more than to copy, paste, and forget. But it also leaves hints around for incident response teams and the like, and it just goes generally against all common folk wisdom of threat acting in the modern day and age. Because nowadays, every malware, almost every malware, the configuration is encrypted and obfuscated in a really nasty and time-consuming way. But these guys, they just put it in a separate file in plain text, right? They are either madmen or geniuses. There is really no in between. And if you want an argument in favor of the geniuses hypothesis, take a look at this screenshot, which we obtained when we uploaded the Pay2Key sample first to VirusTotal. No detections. One detection, right? Probably by an engine that just reports everything as positive, and then it never has any false negatives. Great technical achievement. So, no detections, and you're asking yourself, why are there no detections? But that's the wrong question. You should be asking yourself, why would there be any detections? I mean, where do you get detections? What are your main tools in a security solution? The sandbox and static signatures based on YARA rules and regular expressions and whatnot. But the file is not going to run inside the sandbox. The sandbox is going to take the file isolated from its expected environment, the configuration file, and just run it. And there's going to be no behavior. The malware is not going to run, so that you won't get a detection. Now you're left with only static signatures like it's 1998. But you know, this is a new strain of ransomware, at least back then it was, so of course there were no static signatures. And so the answer to the question, where are you going to get detections for this? Both in theory and in practice, the answer appears to be from nowhere. So by mistake or not, these guys stumbled onto what could, when refined, become a really, really nasty trick of bypassing sandboxes. I'll just put it in the very large bin of stuff that I've run across in malware and then sat down and silently prayed, I hope this doesn't catch on. Well, in the department of writing to files and reading from files were not strictly necessary. These guys also had their ransomware write everything it does to a nice plaintext log. At this point, this is no surprise. You know, the victims can just sit down and read in a convenient plaintext how screwed they were. This was a work in progress. Some earlier versions had stubs and declared functionality that was only implemented later. This is not unheard of. We've seen it in a much more intensive way in, for example, GunCrab. But it's still interesting. A lot of ransomware is just write once and keep infecting people later without any further updates. So it's nice that they kept putting work into it. It shows they cared. This malware, and this is the second category I mentioned earlier, it communicates with a C2 server. Now, usually for a lot of types of malware, this is standard, but for ransomware, it's not strictly necessary. This is not Crypto 101, it's not Introduction to Public Key Cryptography, so I'm not going to explain in full why exactly it's not necessary. I'll just say that you can have a perfectly working ransomware operation by just taking an RSA public key and embedding it in the executable you use to infect your victims. So if you have a C2 server up and running, it should be due to curiosity. These guys, they actually, when the ransomware runs, it asks the C2 server for a public key, for an RSA public key, and I'll touch later on what's so strange about that, apart from the fact that it's not necessary at all. So now that they have CNC communication, which they didn't have to do, they are worried about the communication being intercepted. So they use this trick which you see on screen, and really the less said about this, the better. It communicates using a non-standard hard-coded port which is there in the plaintext configuration. Maybe even they felt sort of weird about that, so they arranged for an additional nice and nifty trick where if you go to an infected machine, double-click the plain text configuration and look for the C2 server IP address, actually, chances are you'll find an IP address of one of the infected machines inside the network, which is, strange. It's like one of those horror movie cliches. The calls are coming from inside the house. How is the C2 server inside the network? Actually, what happens is that they designate one of the infected machines as a proxy server. And then all the other machines have that IP address of the designated machine as their C2 server address. They communicate with it, and it communicates with the C2 server on their behalf. So now it's a two-step process. You want to see the C2 IP, you open the config, you find the IP address of the designated proxy, then you find that physical machine and you double-click the config there. And now you have the C2 address. Was it worth it? Well, you'd be surprised. Hurling inconveniences at people often works when in theory it shouldn't. And these guys, the attack went phenomenally well, so we can't argue with success. What can this ransomware do? A lot of stuff, most of which is standard, by the way. I'm going to touch on the non-standardness of some of it in a moment. One of the things I mentioned earlier is receiving an RSA public key from the CNC server, which is mighty strange. If you're doing it in order to use the key to encrypt files, like I already said, it's not necessary. Around 2012, this was all the rage for ransomware to contact the C2 server and receive a public key. And then firewalls started blocking the communication. So this is where ransomware authors collectively realized that they don't have to talk to CNC. So seeing this again in modern ransomware is kind of jarring. And if they're doing it in order to communicate with the CNC server in an encrypted fashion, it's kind of like a re-implementation of SSL. I don't know which scenario is the wackier among the two. So apart from that, it's all standard here. You can't have a ransomware without changing the victim's background picture. I mean, come on. But one thing that's hidden here and is worth mentioning is RAT functionality. Having a C2 server for ransomware is not necessary, but having RAT functionality is way beyond not necessary. It's almost unheard of, honestly, for ransomware. Ransomware usually does not bother, but these guys, let's not mince words, they were control freaks. They wanted to know who was infected, and they wanted to be able to tell the ransomware to do things on the fly, post-infection, and the moment the fancy strike them. So this is somewhat of a testament to their frame of mind. And from this final and over-the-top instance of CNC communication and general communication where communication is not necessary, we'll move on to my favorite category, which is strange choices when implementing cryptography. The first among those is the use of RC4. Now, RC4 is very popular in malware. Malware authors use it all the time simply because it's easy to implement. It is also much easier to shoot yourself in the foot when using RC4 as opposed to, let's say, AES. But a lot of malware authors, again, they want something easy to implement, so they go with RC4. The interesting thing is that the authors of Pay2Key did not implement anything themselves, which is commendable, actually. They went to the Windows Crypto API and they asked it to give them a cryptographic context and did everything by the book. So this is fine, and using RC4, like I said earlier, is also fine out of necessity, because if you're a malware author, you're not going to re-implement AES. But the combination of those two aspects is really strange. They went to the cryptographic service provider and they saw the entire world of well-implemented and well-regarded cryptography out there, and then they picked RC4. What for? I don't know. I would have picked AES if I were them. But who knows what the motivation was. I don't think I've ever seen it in my life before this malware creating an instance of the service provider, the crypto service provider, and then asking it to encrypt using RC4. I haven't seen it before in malware. It's really something. And in general, it shows somewhat of familiarity and a close relationship with the cryptographic provider for them to ask to make such an unorthodox request of it. So naturally, it isn't the only instance of that. When they invoke the cryptographic context the first time, they do something I also haven't seen before in any ransomware, and I've seen quite a lot of them. They actually put something other than a null value in the container parameter. Now, the code for creating the cryptographic provider context is copy and pasted and copy and pasted and copy and pasted in all ransomware ever, and the parameter is always null. Actually, every parameter that can be null usually is null in this copy-paste. These guys don't want to deal with the Windows crypto API, and honestly, I don't really blame them. But these guys, the Pay2Key guys, they actually, I don't know, someone there actually sat down and read the docs. And they realized that, hey, by setting a null value for the parameter, we are using the default container. What should we use? Why should we use the default container when we can name our own specific container? So that's what they did. And I've seen very rarely this piece of code in its non-copy-pasted form, and I have to say that it is glorious. Now, finally, in the category of weird crypto choices, there's this block of code, which is really a significant achievement in that you can look at it completely out of context and immediately be able to tell what is wrong. Here, a cryptographic key is derived deterministically from a hash, which is also derived deterministically from victim machine characteristics, such as, you know, the HDD serial number and whatnot. There's all sorts of parameters these guys like to use for that sort of thing. And what's frustrating about this is that it's a demonstration of how crypto is hard when you're writing crypto, but you know what? Crypto is even harder sometimes when you're attacking crypto, because this is a mistake what you're seeing on screen, that if there were a big red book of what not to do in crypto, this would be on page like 4 or 5, but still somehow they managed to stumble forward by writing this code into a ransomware that still could not be broken. No one was able to write a decryptor for the Pay2Key ransomware, which it just goes to show you how sometimes life really is not fair. You can look at a piece of cryptographic code and say, wow, by sheer pure luck, these guys were able to write a crypto implementation that I am not able to break. It was this close, but no. So this is the type of despair that as malware researchers we have to deal with regularly. So on this very optimistic note, I am now going to pass the presentation on to Gil, who will talk to you about the actually interesting parts and aspects of the Pay2Key ransomware campaign. Your turn, Gil.
Hi everyone, my name is Gil Mansharov and I am a malware analyst in Checkpoint's threat intelligence team. Until now, we covered the technical aspect of the campaign. It's time to dig deeper, analyze the campaign, and see how it actually works. So every time we're analyzing a campaign, we're focusing on several main questions. The first question is, who are the targets? The second question is, who is behind it? The third question is, how did they do it? And of course, why did they do it and what is their motive? I'll try to answer these questions in the next slides. The first question that we'll try to answer is, who are the targets? So, who are the targets? Most of the victims are companies based in Israel, and there's also one company in Italy that was compromised. Like a typical double extortion operation, the attackers leaked information from the victims into a Tor-based server. We could find some of the victims there by looking at the folder names. All the companies that we see here are based in Israel, so we know that this is what these companies have in common. The next question that we try to answer is, who is behind it? Usually, ransomware operators attach contact information on the ransom note for communication with the victims. Communication with the victims is very important for negotiations and queries. The victim should trust the attacker that the files will be decrypted after the payment. So, except email, Pay2Key operators use Keybase as a communication method. So, what is Keybase? Keybase is a platform for secure and private messaging with end-to-end encryption. Pay2Key used Keybase in order to hide their identity. Interesting thing to note is that the Keybase account of Pay2Key operators was opened in June 2020, which is 4 or 5 months before the first attack. It means that Pay2Key operators prepared the attack infrastructure for more than 4 months. Eventually, we understood that it will be hard to track Pay2Key operators based on the contact information. So we decided to follow the money trail left by the paying victims. First of all, each ransom note of Pay2Key contained a Bitcoin wallet to transfer the money. We already had few ransom notes of Pay2Key, which means that maybe we can track few of the Bitcoin wallets of the attackers, so this is what we did. First of all, we already had wallets of the attackers from the ransom notes. We also saw incoming transactions from ransomware victims to these wallets. From there, the money is transferred to an intermediate wallet, which is the same wallet for both wallets. From there, the money is transferred to a final wallet. The final wallet is part of an Iranian cryptocurrency exchange named Excoino. So how can we confirm that the final wallet is part of the Iranian cryptocurrency exchange Excoino? Stay with me here because it's a bit complicated. First of all, we need to find a confirmed wallet of Excoino. The way we chose is to watch a YouTube tutorial for Excoino. During the video tutorial, we saw the wallet that used to demonstrate proper usage of Excoino platform. So now, we have a confirmed wallet of Excoino. Luckily for us, we can use known techniques of blockchain network clustering in order to check which cluster the confirmed Excoino wallet belongs to. We also checked which cluster the final wallet of Pay2Key belongs to. And we can see that it belongs to the same cluster as the confirmed wallet of Excoino. So, in conclusion, we can say with a very high probability that the final wallet of Pay2Key is part of Excoino, an Iranian cryptocurrency exchange. Now, let's talk more about Excoino, the cryptocurrency exchange that Pay2Key operators are using. First of all, Excoino is an Iranian cryptocurrency exchange. In order to confirm it, we can take a look in the terms of use page in Excoino website. We can see that it's written in Persian that this site is for Iranian users under the laws of the Islamic Republic of Iran. Second of all, you must have an Iranian ID and phone number in order to use Excoino. Again, in its terms of use, Excoino states that you need to be identified in order to use its platform. Another interesting thing to note is that Excoino states that the first transaction and any suspicious transaction will be reported to the Iranian cyber police. The meaning is that the Iranian cyber police should have been informed on the first transaction of Pay2Key operators. Important thing to mention is that one of the most significant aspects of attribution is the targeting, and in this case almost all the attacks exclusively targeted Israel. Our evidence on Pay2Key and Excoino, along with the targeting, makes it more evident that Iranian citizens are behind Pay2Key, and maybe in this case the Iranian cyber police will turn a blind eye. Okay, so we trace the attack back to Iran. From here, let's jump straight into one of the more interesting aspects of this campaign, and it's the extensive public relations effort, which is quite unusual to ransomware campaigns. First of all, why would the attackers invest their time on media coverage? The simple answer is that media coverage could add extra pressure on the victims, especially if the victim is a well-known organization. Another possible reason is that the goal of Pay2Key operators is to cause damage to the image of known Israeli organizations, in order to harm the Israeli image in general. So how Pay2Key leverage their achievements into media coverage? The first method is by creating Twitter posts and make the readers involved. The second method is mentioning and tagging known Israeli media accounts. In addition, we can understand that media coverage is important to Pay2Key operators, because every time their Twitter account is getting suspended, they immediately create a new account in order to maintain the hype around their attacks. We mentioned the double extortion tactic that Pay2Key operators are using. Part of this tactic includes leaking information from the victims. Pay2Key operators created a simple website to leak information. We can see that the website has a structure of a file system with a directory for each organization. However, the user interface of the website is very simple, and if you want media coverage for the website, it's not enough. So what did Pay2Key operators do? They upgraded the website, and now it has more visual interface that includes the map of Israel. When we see the new website with the map of Israel in it, we can say that beyond any doubt, this campaign is targeting Israel. So after Pay2Key operators made a lot of effort in order to get media coverage, we can ask ourselves, did it work? Let's judge the results. We can see that Pay2Key operators get media coverage for hacking an Israeli Intel-acquired startup. Another example is that media coverage for their claims to hack Portnox, an Israeli cybersecurity firm. And the last example shows that upgrading the leaks website was a smart investment, as it got media coverage for clearly targeting Israel. In this moment, we already know that Israel was the target of the attacks, and the source of the attacks is probably from Iran. Before we dig in deeper into the campaign, let's take a wider look and examine this campaign in reflection to Iran-Israel cyber conflict timeline. Back in 2010, Stuxnet, probably the most sophisticated piece of malware in that time, was discovered in Iran's nuclear reactors. The development of Stuxnet, along with the infection of Iran's nuclear reactors with it, are attributed to the United States and Israel. On April 2020, there was a report on a cyber attack on Israel's water system. The attack has been attributed to Iran. In this attack, there was an attempt to raise the chlorine levels in the water. Few weeks later, on May 2020, there was a report on a cyber attack on a naval port in Iran. The attack has been attributed to Israel. This attack has shut down the activity on this port and disrupted the movements of ships nearby. More than a month later, on June 25, there was a report on explosion in an Iranian military base. According to few reports, the explosion has been caused by a cyber attack, attributed to Israel. 3 days later, after the attack, on June 28, Pay2Key operators created a Keybase account used to communicate with the victims of the ransomware. Few months later, on November 2020, the first wave of Pay2Key has been seen in Israel, encrypting and leaking information from few organizations based in Israel. On December 2020, the second wave of Pay2Key attacks has been seen in Israel. One thing to note is that in the second wave of the attacks, the Pay2Key ransomware was already known by the cybersecurity industry. In this wave, there were no reports on ransomware infections, but only reports on data leaks from Israeli organizations using Pay2Key Twitter accounts. We saw that Pay2Key is under active development, but in April 2021 we had a ransomware incident in an Israeli company that looked familiar, and it called itself Networm. When we analyzed the ransomware, we saw that it shares a lot of code with Pay2Key, and our conclusion was that this ransomware, called Networm, is an evolution of Pay2Key. Besides encrypting files, it seems that Networm ransomware used another custom-made tool called Free Space Worker. What this tool does? Well, it just creates zero-field temporary files and deletes them. This way, the ransomware makes sure that the free space in the hard disk is filled with zeros, which makes it harder to recover the files from the hard disk. So far, we analyzed the ransomware and the campaign itself. The last question left is, why did they do it? The first option is hacktivism. Maybe Pay2Key operators attacked Israeli organizations as a result of an anti-Israel agenda. When talking on hacktivism operations against Israel, the most notable operation is known as Op Israel, and it mostly includes DDoS attacks and website corruptions. In the recent op Israel, we saw an attack similar to Pay2Key, where a hacking group named Black Shadow hacked into an Israeli insurance company named Shearbit and leaked its information. The attack happened a few weeks after the first wave of the Pay2Key attacks, and maybe Black Shadow, the attackers, absorbed inspiration from Pay2Key operators after the media coverage it received. But not only Pay2Key operators received media coverage. Black Shadow leaked information from a known Israeli insurance company, putting sensitive information of its customers in risk. But hacktivism is not the only option for the motive of Pay2Key operators. First of all, we know that there is a cyber conflict between Israel and Iran. Second, Pay2Key operators claim to hack an Israeli defense company named Elta, which belongs to the Israeli government. In this case, we understand that Pay2Key operators aren't targeting only organizations from the Israeli private sector. The meaning is that Pay2Key operators' motive might be espionage, which raises the possibility for a state-sponsored attack. And third, Clear Sky, who also investigated this attack, attributed Pay2Key to Fox Kitten with a medium to high confidence. For those of you that aren't familiar with Fox Kitten group, Fox Kitten is known as an Iranian state-sponsored APT group, which means that this attack might be state-sponsored. So Pay2Key operators might be hacktivists or state-sponsored, but after the attacks, there was an interesting plot twist. An Israeli account on Twitter claimed to have information on Pay2Key operators. Some of the information given by this account mentions the usage of Excoino by Pay2Key operators, and it claims to uncover the identity of Pay2Key operators. But whoever behind this account can't work alone, and it seems to recruit Israeli hackers for revenge on Pay2Key operators. We can see here that this account created another account that should hunt Iranian APT groups. However, we don't know if these Twitter accounts are reliable, but we might be witnessing a rising trend where individuals notice a cyber attack on their country and decide to react to it by themselves, fearing that if they won't react to it, no one will react to it. After we published our report on Pay2Key, more and more information started to come up. Regarding the initial access to the victim's network, it seems that one of the methods used by Pay2Key operators to infiltrate networks is by using compromised RDP credentials. More important methods are exploitation of exchange servers, RDP, and VPN like Fortinet SSL. And for lateral movement, Pay2Key makes use of the PSExec tool created by sysinternals. To conclude, we saw a new ransomware strain named Pay2Key, which is targeting Israeli organizations. The ransomware considers simple, not packed with clear text strings, and yet it was very effective. The targets were Israeli organizations, and by following the trails of money and the possible attackers, it seems that Pay2Key operators are probably Iranian citizens. Ransomware operators evolved, and double extortion is used as a strategy to make sure that the victim pays the ransom. Creating hype in social media and gaining media coverage were an essential part of this campaign. And finally, we saw that hacktivist groups may rise and strike back when there is no seen reaction for a cyber attack of a rival nation. Before we finish, we want to thank Clarity Research and Ystream for their contribution to this research, and to our colleague Itai, who worked with us on this research, and we couldn't have done it without him. And that's all for now. If you want to read more from our work, you can visit research.checkpoint.com or follow us in CP Research. If you have any additional questions, you are more than welcome to contact us on our personal Twitter account. Thank you.